Kieran Kirk, for inviting me to come and speak here today about this fascinating question. If this is real, then what is our response? It's an interesting question. It's an important question. It's interesting that there are different reasons to ask that sort of question. Right? We might ask, is this real because we want to know about something, like a material thing? Or we might ask, is this real because we want to know someone? We might want to form a relationship with a person. So we might approach answering the question, is this real, differently depending on the thing that we're asking about and the reason why. So suppose you hear on the news that Apple Corporation has created a new type of material in which to encase the next version of the iPhone. And they claim it is more lightweight and shinier than the original material, and it's shatterproof, it's waterproof, it's even fireproof. And you wonder, is this material real? Right, so how would you go about answering that sort of question? Well, the familiar saying, seeing is believing, might prompt you to want to get a hold of this material, to look at it, to analyze it, to weigh it, to drop it, to try to bend it, to assess its chemical makeup, to hold it next to the older material and compare the two side by side. And this would be learning about something. Right? And it would leave us in control of the interaction with this material object. We would be the one putting all of the exercises and questions to it, bending it, breaking it, dropping it, measuring it, weighing it. Now, suppose you turn over your iPhone, you open it up, you check your social media, and there you see the profile of someone who intrigues you. And they speak Italian, you enjoy speaking Italian. They share your favorite hobby, and they cheer for the same footy team. Then, that person initiates contact with you and invites you to dinner. And so you wonder, is this person for real? Right? And is their profile real? Is what they claim about themselves true? And if I show up for dinner, will I find that the whole thing was just a hoax? So how would you go about answering that sort of question? What would you have to do to get to know a person to find out if their profile was real? Well, you might try to look at them in real life to see if their profile photo matches what they really look like, or whether they just Photoshop it. So you might try to find their address, stake out their house, hope to catch a glimpse of them. If your parent works for the government, you might have access to some high-tech facial recognition software, and you could just check them out using a computer. But would these kinds of things really enable you to get to know the person? I think to get to know a person, you cannot simply look at them. You can't simply weigh them, or measure them, or analyze their material makeup, or study their DNA, or even read descriptions about them. And something more is required. And the additional step I think you would need to take would be a step of trust. You would need to act in trust, accept the invitation, and show up for dinner, and then see what happens. I think this is the way it works with personal relationships. Right? We often have to first act in trust. We have to believe, or at least act as if we believe, and then see if that act leads to evidence justifying our initial trust in this person. And this would be the sort of approach in which we would not remain in control, right? We would have to make ourselves vulnerable to another person. We would have to put questions to them, and then we would have to wait and listen carefully to an answer. That we are not in control with our measuring stick or our scale. Knowing a person is a little bit riskier. So in short, people are different than metal. And when it comes to asking, is this real? It makes all the difference if the thing you are asking about is a person or simply a piece of material. Now, this conference today asks a fundamental question. If this is real, then what is our response? And I would suggest that it makes all the difference what the word "this" refers to, if this is real. Presumably, it has something to do with the Christian faith. But I would argue that at the center of the Christian faith is not just a set of doctrines that you can study and know about using your mind or your computer, perhaps some books. Right? Rather, at the center of the Christian faith is a person. And that makes a big difference for how we explore what it means for this to be real or not. I think we can imagine the Christian faith somewhat as resembling the profile of a person who has posted certain claims about himself and then has initiated contact and invited you to dinner. That is, the center of the "this" for today's conference is a personal invitation. Is it real? And if so, then what? Well, first of all, what is the profile? What does Jesus say about himself? What does he offer? I think many Christians would view Jesus as posting a profile simply about his divine nature. That's the key thing to believe in, right? So Jesus says, "I'm God, believe it." In other words, what Jesus offers in that sense is primarily a set of theoretical doctrines that calls for mental assent. We either do believe that he's divine or we don't. That's the issue. Now, if that's the case, then the "this" of today's conference would refer to the notion that Jesus came to earth to give us the opportunity to mentally assent to claims about him, so that if we do, we will go to heaven when we die. That's the way a lot of people talk about it and approach it. This has been referred to as barcode faith. So you think of God with a big scanner, and he kind of scans your brain looking for some mental beliefs. And if the scanner finds those beliefs in your cranium, then grace pours forth, and we are saved from hell. Now, there are some variations on barcode faith. God could scan, the record of our actions, and if he finds the right number of works, if we've gone to Mass the right number of times, then grace pours forth and we're saved. Right? I would argue that we need a bigger version of the faith, a bigger vision about what it's all about. I would say that the center of Christianity, what Jesus comes to offer us, is not just a set of dogmas or beliefs, but an entire new life, an entire way of being in the world, an entirely new kingdom. And Jesus does not just post claims about his nature and ask us to believe in them, but he initiates personal contact with us. And he asks us to participate with him in a meal. Now, if that's true, then the "this" of today's conference would refer to a new possibility for all of your relationships. A new possibility for all of your activities, all of your decisions. And this is nothing short than the claim that Jesus has begun to usher in God's kingdom on earth. And he is the king. So we could approach it a couple different ways, this question, if this is real. If we take the one that I'm proposing, that Jesus has come to offer you not just dogmas to be mentally agreed with, but a new life to be lived. Then the question is, how do we know if that claim is true? How do we know if that's real? And this is where I want to bring C.S. Lewis into the conversation. Because C.S. Lewis wrestled with these kinds of questions. He was an atheist who could not shake the deep question of what is real and what is true, even though he struggled against where he saw the truth leading. So just a little bit about C.S. Lewis's life. He was born in 1898 in Ireland as Clive Staples Lewis. Clive Staples is what his parents chose to name him. At the age of 4, he insisted on being called Jack for the rest of his life. Interestingly, when we named our son Christopher Samwise, so that he would also have a CS in his initials, but we didn't dare name him Clive Staples. At the age of 9, Jack's mother died, and so he attended boarding school. It was an horrific experience for Lewis, and he later wrote that life at such a vile boarding school is in one sense good preparation for the Christian life, for it teaches one to live by hope or faith. And young Jack used to agonize for hours in nightly prayer. He knew he was supposed to be a Christian, but he would stay up late at night, trying by his own willpower to pray sincerely and vividly, trying to force himself to feel things he thought that Christians were supposed to feel, but he just didn't. At 13, he entered an English preparatory school where he would lose his faith. He would begin smoking. He would acquire a strong interest in the occult. He would accept atheistic thought and become unchaste. So things were headed in a pretty bad direction for Jack. He never could, by the way, later in life, break the addiction to smoking. That would stay with him, even though he would see a change in his other ways of living. Now, at age 16, something important happened for Lewis. He went to live with a tutor. He wanted to give up the boarding school and just have a one-on-one tutor. And so he went to live and study with a gentleman by the name of William Kirkpatrick. And this began to really work something on Lewis. Really, first of all, sharpened a keen sense of logic. William Kirkpatrick was very, very logical and practical, and forced Lewis to justify every single claim he made. Now, if you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, remember that the characters hear Lucy telling them the story about going into this snowy wood and meeting a fawn, and they go and talk to this professor by the name of Professor Kirk. And he tells them, well, using logic, has she ever lied before? Is she trustworthy? And he influences them to think logically about giving what she is saying a chance. Right? So it's based on this character in his own life, William Kirkpatrick. This was also the time when Lewis's imagination began to flourish. He began to read people like George MacDonald, and that was very instrumental in his story. When he reached university age, Lewis attended Oxford, where he began to be challenged by his friends to reconsider his atheism. And he struggled for years. He wrestled for years, over a decade, until finally, after weighing the evidence, he came to admit that a transcendent God was real. And he knelt and prayed as, quote, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. He didn't want to do this. He says he was dragged, kicking and screaming, into the kingdom. But he could not deny that that's where the evidence led. But at that point, he had only converted to theism, not yet to Christianity. It was in 1931, several years later, through conversations with people like J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, and Owen Barfield and others, that Lewis came to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he placed his trust, his active trust, in him. Lewis would go on to write the Chronicles of Narnia and many other popular books, literary criticism, nonfiction. He wrote a whole range of things. And then he died on November 22nd, 1963. Now, if that date rings a bell in anybody's mind, that's the exact same date that John F. Kennedy died. It's the exact same date that Aldous Huxley died. All three of these figures died on exactly the same day. So that a little bit about Lewis, the person. I want to suggest that his life and his writings suggest several ways that we could go about answering the question, how do we know if Jesus and his claims about himself are real? Well, first, Lewis wants us to use our imaginations. He thinks they have a role to play in coming to know the truth. And that's partly because that our imaginations can help us form either proper or improper expectations. As I think about heaven, for example, how do you imagine heaven? What kind of place is it in your imagination? A lot of people think, it's kind of somewhere up there floating above the clouds, and kind of after we die, our disembodied souls are kind of floating around in this ethereal, misty, ghost-like realm. And what we're going to be doing for eternity is kind of gathering around a great big chair and singing songs to the person in that chair. Well, that's exciting. And we kind of wonder, why does heaven not kind of exercise more of a powerful influence on us, especially when you compare it to the kind of real, concrete pleasures and enjoyments that we know we experience day in and day out here on earth? Thank you very much. We'll take these, and we'll wait for kind of the lofty, floaty, misty, ghost-like stuff. We'll leave that till the end. Lewis sits down and he writes a book called The Great Divorce, where characters, after they die, have the opportunity to take a bus ride to a place called the Valley of the Shadow of Light. And they can step off the bus and they can walk around in kind of the outer suburbs, if you will, of heaven. And so the main character, Lewis, steps off the bus, and the grass in this place is so real that it hurts to walk on. It's so sharp, it hurts the feet of the people getting off the bus walking on. The apples in this place are so heavy that they can barely be lifted. And the people who dwell in this place, saints, angels, Lewis calls them real people, bright people, are so substantial, they're so real, that Lewis looks at himself and the others who get off the bus and realizes that they are the ghosts. So he flips it on his head. He says, compared to the way that we understand life and ourselves here on earth, compared to what life with God is really like, we're the ghosts. This is the image or the shadow. And that's reality. And so Lewis begins to say, if you can begin to imagine the claims that Christ makes differently, you will be better prepared to really evaluate whether they're real or not. Second, Lewis says, in addition to the imagination, we should employ logic. We should employ reason. We should not be afraid to evaluate the evidence for Jesus' claims. And when he gets to this question, is this person real? Lewis notes that most respected historians logically conclude that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who lived 2,000 years ago. His existence is as verified using history as anybody else's existence who's ever lived. So the question is not whether someone named Jesus was real, but whether his claims about himself were real. And here Lewis says, apply logic and reason to that question as well. He points out that if you look at the things that Jesus said about himself, he claimed to forgive sins. Right? Which is really the claim that he was the person chiefly offended in any offense that you undertake. So even if you commit an offense against her, if I came to you and said, I forgive you for offending her, that would be pretty bold and rash and probably conceited of me to think that I was the one offended by that. But that's what Jesus walked around claiming. He also, according to Lewis, claimed that he had always existed and that he is coming to judge the world at the end of time. Now, Lewis points out that these things make sense, rational, logical sense, only if Jesus really is God. Otherwise, such claims would amount to a silliness and a conceit unrivaled by any other character in history. And he points out this to prevent people from saying that they accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but they just don't accept his claim to be God. And Lewis writes, quote, "A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher at all. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or he would be a liar, the devil of hell, the master of deception. You must take your choice. Either this was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us." End of quote. So here Lewis is using logic, he's using reason to assess some of the basic claims that Jesus made about himself and asking us what can we logically make of that. But I want to note that we can logically track these arguments and yet still not know the person. And Jesus himself tells us this in Matthew 7. He says, quote, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven. On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not believe you and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me.'" So even Jesus is saying something more is required than just mentally believing in the claims about himself. That brings us to this third thing, which, as you'll recall, is an act of trust. We must take a step in trust, accept what he says, accept the invitation, and show up for the dinner. And then see what happens. See if the evidence justifies our initial placement of trust. As I noted earlier, we don't always believe only what we first see. Seeing is believing works with some things in life. It doesn't work for everything. Sometimes we see only what we are first willing to believe. Lewis wrote in various places of the need to believe in order to see. Perhaps the most memorable is a scene from Prince Caspian, in which Lucy sees Aslan, the lion, in a forest, and she senses that Aslan wants her and her brothers and sisters to follow him in a certain direction. And when she tells her brothers and sisters this, they don't believe her, and thus they can't see Aslan. And she's saying, well, he's right there. He's saying, he's motioning us to go this way. And they look and they say, we simply don't see him. So the next day, the lion wakes Lucy up that night in a dream and tells her that if the others are not willing to follow, then she would have to follow him alone, even if all the others go in a different direction. And so the next day, the others want to go a certain way, but that leads them to a dead end. And so they reluctantly begin to follow Lucy. And then sure enough, She leads them successfully down a steep cliff and across a roaring river, and they begin to say, well, this is actually working. And they begin to place a little bit more trust in Aslan, and then they look across and they see something hazy, the outline of the lion. And the more they believe, the more he comes into focus. So that by the end, when their belief is most solid, they're able to see him as he truly is. I think the lesson for us is, even if you aren't convinced of the evidence up front, even if you are struggling with doubts or fears, take an initial step in faith and see what happens. Go to Mass. Participate in the life of a church youth group. Go on a retreat. Commit to daily prayer and Bible reading. Get to know this person better. And then see what happens. Usually it's in that context in which the evidence presents itself to you. You just need to put yourself in a place where you will be able to see it. It's there, but you might not be able to see it because of something else other than just that intellectual assent. So, if you do that, take that step in faith, you answer the invitation, you show up for dinner, and you find that, lo and behold, Jesus really is who he says he is, then what is the response for the rest of your life? Is it mental belief alone? We know that the first line of the creed that is recited at Mass is, I believe in God, and then the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, I believe in. St. Augustine comes to the creed, and he takes that first line, and he says, okay, I believe in God. He says, in the Latin, the word credo, which means to believe, in Latin has three different senses. You can say credere deum, credere deo, or credere in deum. And each of these Latin phrases means something slightly different. Credere deum means I believe that God exists. Right? I mentally assent to the proposition that there is God, he exists. Credere deo means I believe what God says. I mentally acknowledge that what God says is true. Now, Lewis points out that even the devil, even Satan, believes in those two senses. Nobody believes more in God in those two senses than the devil. But Augustine says, credere in deum means something different. Credere in deum means I commit to and place trust in God. Now, guess which of those three Latin phrases is the one found in the creed? The third one, credere in deum. So when we recite the creed, when the church gathers at Mass and recites the creed, saying in English, I believe in God, we are really declaring that I hereby set my entire life, my mind, my heart, everything I am, in God's direction. Reciting the creed is not an exercise simply listing the propositions about God to which we give mental agreement. Rather, as Augustine said, quote, it is in believing to love, in believing to delight, in believing to walk towards him and be incorporated amongst the limbs or members of his body. End of quote. So, in sum, if this Jesus is real, then our response is to commit our entire lives to him, to walk toward him, to accept his invitation to dinner. In other words, our response is active. It calls for us taking up this life that he offers and living it out. When a character in the book, The Great Divorce, is asked by one of these bright people, will you believe? The character asks, well, believe in what sense? And the bright person responds, will you journey with me to the mountains, closer to where God's home is? Believe in what sense? Will you journey with me? Will you follow actively? So remember, Jesus does not simply want Christians. Jesus wants disciples. Jesus wants apprentices who will work alongside him and spend time with him so that they can become more like him. Now, living out this act of commitment will involve various things. It will include spending time with Jesus in prayer. It will include recognizing and acknowledging to him our personal inadequacy, right? Our inability to live the Christian life ourselves under our own power. Many of you just before this talk did just that in confession. And it will include seeking God's call in every aspect of your life. And I want to just say a couple words about that third thing. Because I think for many people, the temptation is to compartmentalize their faith from the rest of their life. Okay, I believe, and yes, I'll even go and worship on Sunday. Right? But these claims that Jesus made really doesn't have much to do with what I'm doing on Monday at school or a soccer practice or a piano recitals or just hanging out with friends. And so we compartmentalize our faith only to special times and to special places. Right? Going to Mass on a Sunday morning, or perhaps saying the Rosary at night before we go to bed. But the religion that Jesus is about should not be relegated to just a corner of life or just a set of activities. Christ calls us to follow him. This is both lay people and members of religious orders. He calls everyone to follow him in every aspect of their life. So your education, your family life, your choice of friends, your athletic endeavors, your choice of fashion and music and how you spend your money, all of it should bear on your faith, or you should bring your faith to bear on all of it. Now, C.S. Lewis was talking once to a group of students at Oxford, and he raised this question to them. So here you are, there's actually a war going on, and here you sit at Oxford studying poetry and Shakespeare. How in the world can you justify that? Not only does your country need you off at war, but why aren't you out saving souls? Right? How can you justify doing these ordinary, kind of trivial things like studying poetry? And Lewis gives the answer. He says, quote, "Before I became a Christian, I do not think I fully realized that one's life after conversion would inevitably consist in doing most of the same things one had been doing before. The difference is that they would be done in a new spirit, but they would still be doing the same things." And the different spirit is captured in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Lewis quotes, "Whatever you eat, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do everything to the glory of God." So, part of our response to the claims of Jesus being real are that we are to engage in the natural, ordinary human activities, reading books, listening to music, talking with friends, going to work, and so forth. But we should do them in a different way. We should do them to the glory of God. And as we do, we should be attentive to the particular strengths and gifts and interests and passions that God has placed inside of us. Because there are different strengths and gifts and interests and passions than he has placed in anybody else. And we should be attentive to the opportunities to use those gifts and passions for the greater good of the communities in which we are placed. This is what some traditions call a vocation, what others call a calling. The point I want you to take from Lewis is that you may be called to do things that are explicitly religious. You may be called to be a priest. You may be called to join a religious order. And if you are, then you should pursue that with joy and gladness. But you don't have to be called to a religious order to bring glory to God. You are called to glorify God in everything you do, even if the ordinary activity you engage in doesn't seem religious, like studying poetry. But Lewis says that God created ordinary human activities, like studying poetry, as goods for us to participate in and enjoy. And in doing those things well, we can also do them in a sense of doing them for God's sake. So don't give in to the temptation to think that God wants obedience in these kinds of activities, but not those kinds of activities. Instead, seek to engage every activity in your ordinary life, whether it be practicing the piano, writing a poem, learning photography, or designing a new iPhone cover, as an opportunity to make something good, something true, something beautiful out of God's creation. Might be able to help another person in love. In other words, view all of life as an opportunity to respond to God's call. Now, Lewis said that as you do this, you will likely experience one other kind of sense. And that is a sense for a certain kind of longing, certain desire that is not meant to be satisfied through any normal human activity on this earth. Since such longings point to the fact that we were made for something more than this earth. That our true home is not on this earth. And this is the kind of longing that Lewis puts into the character of Reepicheep in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Reepicheep has felt a certain spell on his entire life ever since he was a baby. And he is driven by that spell toward the edge of Narnia. When he finally gets to the edge of Narnia, he says these wonderful words, one of my favorite quotes from Narnia. He says, quote, "My own plans are made. While I can, I sail east in the Dawn Treader. When she fails me, I paddle east in my coracle. When she sinks, I shall swim east with my four paws. And when I can swim no longer, if I have not reached Aslan's country or shot over the edge of the world in some vast cataract, I shall sink with my nose to the sunrise." Reepicheep. It's great. Now, this sort of desire, constant spell that I'm trying to get to my true homeland, was explained by Lewis in Mere Christianity. He writes there, quote, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy, or echo, or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that country and to help others to do the same." So in conclusion, the "this" of today's conference does not simply refer to a doctrine to be mentally assented to. It refers instead to a person, and this person's claim to offer a life. And what you do with a life is you live it. He offers a dance, and what you do with the dance is you join up in it. What he offers is an adventure, and what you do with an adventure is not just read about it or learn about it, you experience it. So don't just learn about Jesus as a curiosity. Rather, step out in faith, spend time with this person, get to know him, and then see if the evidence justifies your initial step of trust. Then when you find out he is real, commit your entire life in his direction. Not just a certain activity during a certain time slot each month or each week, but all of you and all of your life. And whether you are called to be a butcher or a baker or a winemaker, remember what C.S. Lewis offers as a sort of mission statement for your life. I must make it the main object of life to press on to my true country and to help others to do the same. Thank you very much. Some time for questions. Does this make sense? If so, what are the implications? How should we dive deeper into this? So, does anybody have any comments, questions, objections?
About developing that relationship and meeting, God and stuff, it's easy to say, like to try it out and do it, but how would you do that? Because I know for most of us, prayer is a little bit tricky. You feel a bit stupid sometimes just talking to nothing. What would you suggest as like how to, enter into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that an atheist English professor asked one of my theology professors when I was at Duke University. Explained to me, how would I ever go about, learning this? He was expecting this theology professor to draw out some proof and to go into an argument. And here's what the theology professor did. They were on the quad in the middle of Duke University. He said, okay, the first thing you do is you get down on your knees like this. Now we're going to really do it. Get down on your knees like this. The guy was really embarrassed. Now you do this with your hands. Like this. And you say the following words. Repeat them after me. Come on. Our Father who art in heaven. And his point in doing that was to say, I can't help you to see the truth of this from the outside. You have to become a member of the body that lives in this way, speaks in this way, does these things with their hands and with their tongues. And so if you want to kind of learn more, you have to become a part of the community of people that is living this different kind of life. And there's no shortcut to that. There's a famous scene at the end of the last battle where one of the, his name was Emeth, he worships a different god. He worships the devil almost all the way through the book. And then he dies and encounters Aslan. And he recognizes Aslan and he's accepted into Aslan's country. And the question that I always pose for my students is, what does, C.S. Lewis believes that people go to hell, right? But what does offering people an opportunity to believe look like such that if they rejected it, they would go to hell? Is somebody standing on the corner preaching hellfire and brimstone? If you walk by and hear that, have you been offered the gospel? Such that if you reject it, if you don't follow it or believe in it, you've had your...